Hey there, so in today's video I will be doing a frog marker drawing. Let's get started! Beforehand, I prepared a pencil sketch which shows the frog. I did this off cam because that allowed me to focus on my sketch and move around as needed. To help me creating this sketch, I used thumbnails I made in my sketchbook, and I also searched for reference photos. I didn't redraw the reference photos, I just used them to get a feeling for the anatomy. Now, the first thing that I do is to redraw the lines of my sketch with a fine liner. This sketch is made in my sketchbook, so I have to transfer it onto another piece of paper. In general, my sketchbooks allow me to be more experimental and also to try things out. It also allows me to erase more and to make mistakes, so this is the reason why I don't make the sketch on the paper I like to use in my final artwork. At least I try to. To transfer my artwork, I put a lightning pad under my piece of paper which is in my sketchbook. Then I can put another piece of paper on top of my sketch which is in my sketchbook and trace all the lines. Before I start coloring, I even tested some of my materials in my sketchbook. And here you can see me adding a tree in the background. Now it's time to add the first lines. In my case, I'm using the Sakura Pigma Micron in orange to outline the orange parts. So here's an important information for you. In general, it doesn't matter what art supplies you are using and if they are high quality or not. But if you are using different mediums like I do, you have to make sure that they work together. For example, in my case, I want to have the outlines I'm doing here as outlines. So in my case, I have to make sure that my markers I'm going to use don't act as a solvent for my outlines. Otherwise, my outlines could bleed and get messy. The Pigma Microns have archival ink inside, so once they are dry, they don't get messed up with my alcohol markers I'm going to use. In general, and if you are not sure, you can test this with your art mediums on a separate piece of paper before you start coloring. Another tip is to look for art mediums which are based on a different medium. For example, typically water-based fineliners would work with alcohol-based markers, and water-based markers would work with alcohol-based fineliners. Here you can see me outlining all the different parts of the frog with different colors. I tried to use colors which were similar to the markers I choose for coloring the inside. But I even tried to choose colors which were slightly darker so that the outline is more outstanding. After I'm done with the outlining, I made sure to erase all the sketch underneath the lines. This leaves me with a nice clean result. Now I can start coloring with my alcohol-based markers. I started with the eyes and made sure to shade them as well. on the frog's foot is very thin, so I tried to recreate this in my artwork. Therefore, I built up the colors in different layers and started with a light shade of orange. Later, I blend the color into the other colors I'm using. With a darker shade of orange, I colored in the areas where my shadows will be. Now some areas are still too bright and the blending is missing. Therefore, I'm changing back and forth between my different shades of orange. And I go quickly over the same areas again and again. While I'm doing this, I still try to keep the inside in another shade than the outside. To achieve this, I don't use the shades equally. Instead, I use one shade more often on an area where I want to have it more outstanding. As far as blending goes, I try to make sure that there are no harsh edges and that the transition between different shades is smooth. I repeat this process for all the parts of the frog I'm coloring with my markers. In the middle of the chest area, I made sure that my brush strokes fade out. This way, I applied only a light layer of color. And this even allows me to blend in some lighter colors such as yellow. As I said before, these markers are all alcohol based. And because they have at least a similar base, they allow me to blend even better together. Another great thing which helps me with blending are the brush tips. It helps me achieving a gradient effect by each single stroke I apply. As you can see here, at first I apply a base layer and then I add more layers. Even in the base layer, I try to get a gradient where needed. Then I add more color to the areas which should be darker and fade the darker areas out to the lighter ones. Therefore, I'm using a color tone which is in between my darker and lighter shades. Here I decided to add more yellow to the feet of my frog. Something to remember with this medium is that darker areas will stay dark. So you have to kind of work from light to dark. At least this is a good advice. But as you can see here, it's possible to add at least some lighter color on top and mix them into the darker colors which are underneath. It won't make a huge difference, but it's enough to recognize it. After I have finished coloring the jaw of the frog, which I did the same way as the chest, I move on to color the rest of the frog in green. Like I did with the orange parts, I use a middle, a light and a darker shade of green here. As far as blending and shading goes, I used the same technique as I did with the orange color tones. And as said before, I tried to keep the lightest parts light. Just a quick note for you here, I made mistakes when I was shading the head of the frog. Normally this isn't a big issue for me and I also went not for a realistic approach, but it bothers me in the end a little bit. So if you are doing something like that, plan out beforehand where your light source is and make sure that you place shading and highlights correctly. At least if this is something you care for. Okay, now I moved on to the background and I realized that I was missing the footage where I filmed how I colored the stem. Basically, I used two different shades of brown and used the lighter one to color in the whole stem and the darker one to add shadows. For the rest of the background, I went with the lighter purple at first. Like I did with the frog, I placed some more layers of color on top of my background colors. I used the same technique for shading and blending as mentioned before. Then I move on adding some more detail to the stem by using a Unipin brush pen. And finally, here comes another layer for the purple background. Here's something interesting. This is another blending method which works with these markers. Some brush tips of specific pens are designed to hold the ink of another marker and release it in a gradient. To transfer ink, place both markers so that the brush tips touch. Next, hold both markers vertically so that the ink can flow to the bottom brush tip. If you use the marker which was on the bottom now, you will get a gradient from the top marker color to the second marker color. Depending on how long the marker was left on top, you will get a shorter or a longer gradient. As far as I know, these markers are available from Deco Time and Chameleon, and Deco Time is not refillable, whereas Chameleon is refillable but also more expensive. If you decide to only use this technique, it will take you longer than the other one, because you always have to wait in between. Another issue can be that there's only a limited color palette available. But to be honest, the results are very beautiful. Personally, I like to use both techniques because they all have their advantages and disadvantages. And when combined, I can get the best of both worlds. As you can see here, I decided to add some blends in the background with a darker purple shade. Initially, this was not planned, but while I was working on my artwork, I thought that the background was looking a little bit simple. Deciding on such a big change can be a little bit risky, because some ideas in mind seem to be great, but when done and it's just a try, there's always a risk that they don't turn out as imagined. In cases like that, where there's already a lot of work done, it can mess up the whole artwork. This is the reason why planning in thumbnails are a very good idea. But there can be always unexpected things like in this case. But here I'm so glad and happy that I choose to add all the blends in the background. They really bring the piece together and it looks beautiful. Now it's time to add the final touches. Carefully, I add some details to the eyes and used some wax-based pencils from Koh-i-Noor on top of my frog. That way I can give my frog more texture and it makes it more interesting. Next, I'm using a good white gel pen to add my highlights. Here I'm using the Unibolt Signo. I place the highlights everywhere where the light is reflected a lot, especially on wet areas such as the eyes and in case of a frog, also on the skin. Because this is not a realistic illustration, I decided to only place highlights on the frog and not on the background or the stem. make my frog more outstanding, which is the main part of my illustration, I decided to give it a white outline. To make it even more pop, I decided to add another outline in black. Therefore, I'm using a black Molotov 1-for-all marker. They are really pigmented, and once they are dry, they have a very nice color. Because as you can see here, it's a really nice, deep and very dark black. And it makes the contrast to the white outline even bigger. And now I'm done! This is the final result. If you enjoyed this video, I would be very happy if you leave a like, subscribe for more content like that, and see you next time!